I should have turned around the second I saw the sign that read, Silver Creek Estates, private HOA property. But the strange thing about inherited land is that it remembers your family even after everyone else forgets. The tires of my old Ford F-250 crunched over the gravel shoulder as I eased to a stop, and for a moment all I heard was the distant hum of lawn sprinklers and the soft buzz of cicadas floating through the warm Texas afternoon. According to my grandfather's will, every inch stretching beyond that polished stone entrance belonged to me. 1,100 acres. Yet standing in front of me was a neighborhood so complete it looked like it had been there forever. Brick homes lined perfectly curved streets. White mailboxes stood in flawless rows. Golf carts rolled lazily beneath towering oak trees. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks that shouldn't have existed. A clubhouse overlooked an artificial lake where fountains sprayed sparkling water into the air. Someone had built an entire suburban kingdom on land my family had owned for nearly 70 years. I reached into the passenger seat and picked up the worn leather folder my attorney had handed me 3 days earlier. Inside rested the original deed, yellowed with age, bearing my grandfather Walter Walker's signature and the county seal that transferred every acre into my name after probate closed. I ran my thumb across the paper, feeling the raised embossing beneath my fingertips. Paper doesn't lie. Property records don't develop opinions. Land doesn't simply decide it belongs to someone else. Yet everything my eyes saw insisted otherwise. I stepped out of the truck, and the smell of freshly cut grass mixed with expensive fertilizer drifted across the breeze. Somewhere nearby, a riding mower shut off. The neighborhood looked almost too perfect, like every blade of grass had signed an agreement never to grow above regulation height. Then I noticed the security camera mounted above the stone entrance slowly rotating until it pointed directly at me. Less than 30 seconds later, an electric golf cart rounded the corner with surprising speed. The man driving wore a crisp polo shirt embroidered with the HOA logo, mirrored sunglasses, and the relaxed confidence of someone who had repeated the same speech hundreds of times. He stopped a few feet away, smiled politely, and rested one arm across the steering wheel. "Afternoon, sir. Residence only beyond this point." I smiled back. "Actually, I own this property." His expression never changed. "I'm afraid that's not possible." I held up the leather folder. "I'm Ethan Walker. I inherited 1,100 acres here last week." He gave the documents one quick glance before shaking his head. "Sir, this entire subdivision is private property managed by Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association. If you continue past this entrance without authorization, I'll have to report you for trespassing." The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Trespassing. On my own land. I looked past him toward the winding streets disappearing over the hills my grandfather used to describe in bedtime stories. Every house, every driveway, every decorative fence, every tree someone had planted after my family stopped visiting the ranch was sitting exactly where my grandfather's maps said cattle once grazed. Whoever built this place hadn't occupied a forgotten corner. They had claimed the heart of the ranch itself. And judging by the confidence in that guard's voice, they honestly believed I was the one who didn't belong. I sat back inside the truck without starting the engine. The leather on the steering wheel had already warmed under the Texas sun, and the air carried that familiar mix of dust, cedar, and fresh-cut grass that instantly pulled me backward 25 years. My grandfather used to park in almost this exact spot every Saturday morning before sunrise. Back then there were no brick entrances, no decorative fountains, and certainly no neighborhood association claiming authority over anything. There were only open fields stretching farther than a kid could run, barbed wire fences that seemed to touch the horizon, and the old windmill whose steady squeak became the soundtrack of every summer I ever remembered. Walter Walker never called it a ranch. He always called it home. Every acre had a story attached to it. That hill overlooking the creek was where my great-grandfather built the first cabin after returning from the Second World War. The oak grove near the western fence line was planted by my grandmother one tree at a time because she believed every family should leave behind something that would outlive them. Even the shallow pond that collected rainwater every spring existed because my grandfather refused to let drought decide whether his cattle survived another season. When I was 8 years old, he handed me a faded survey map and told me something I never forgot. He said, "People think they own land, Ethan. The truth is the land only lets you borrow it for a little while. Your job is to leave it better than you found it. I believed him. Maybe that is why I became a civil engineer instead of chasing quick money somewhere in a downtown office tower. I spent the next 15 years designing highways, bridges, and flood control projects across Texas, always assuming the ranch would still be waiting whenever life slowed down enough for me to return. Then projects became promotions, promotions became longer assignments, and 1 year quietly turned into another. Grandpa never complained. Every Sunday evening he still called me, asking how work was going before telling me the rainfall totals, the condition of the fences, or whether the bluebonnets had started blooming along the southern pasture. His voice always sounded strongest whenever he talked about the land. 3 months before he passed away, he made me promise something during our last visit together. We stood beside the old windmill as the evening breeze rattled its rusted blades, and he placed one weathered hand on my shoulder. No matter how much this county changes, he said, never let anyone convince you that history stops mattering just because somebody poured concrete over it. At the time, I thought he was talking about the developers buying neighboring ranches. I had no idea how literal those words would become. After the funeral, everything happened faster than I expected. Probate took nearly 11 months. My mother's health kept me occupied in Dallas. Work deadlines piled higher than ever. By the time the estate officially transferred into my name, I had only glanced at the paperwork before locking the deed inside my office safe. I assumed the ranch was sitting exactly where my grandfather had left it, waiting patiently beneath the same wide Texas sky. Now, staring through my windshield at streets that had erased nearly every landmark from my childhood, I realized someone else had spent those same 11 months writing a very different story across my family's land. The security guard remained parked beside my truck, pretending to check something on his tablet while never taking his eyes off me. He was polite enough to avoid creating a scene, but it was obvious he had already decided I was nothing more than another stranger who had wandered into a private neighborhood by mistake. I reached for my phone instead of arguing. Experience had taught me that people reveal far more when they believe they are completely right. A few minutes later, another golf cart rolled toward the entrance. Only this one looked less like neighborhood security and more like a parade float for suburban authority. It was spotless, trimmed with polished chrome, and carried a small silver plaque displaying the words Board President. The woman behind the wheel slowed to a graceful stop before stepping onto the pavement with practiced confidence. She looked to be in her early 50s, dressed in an immaculate white blouse, tailored navy slacks, and shoes that had clearly never touched mud. A delicate perfume drifted across the warm breeze, almost overpowering the scent of fresh mulch surrounding the entrance sign. Her smile arrived before her words did, smooth enough to convince anyone who had never been on the receiving end of it. "Good afternoon," she said. "I am Margaret Whitmore. I understand there has been a misunderstanding." I introduced myself and handed her a copy of the recorded deed. She accepted it with 2 fingers, glanced at the first page for barely 2 seconds, then folded it closed without reading another line. "Mr. Walker," she replied, "county paperwork can be confusing after someone passes away. I assure you this community has operated here for many years. Our residents purchased their homes legally. Our association maintains every road, every utility, and every common area you see." Her voice never rose. She spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had repeated the same explanation dozens of times until she believed it herself. I looked past her toward the clubhouse sitting beside the lake. A breeze rippled across the water where families relaxed beneath colorful umbrellas. None of them had any idea they were spending a quiet Saturday afternoon on land my grandfather once rode across checking cattle fences. "Do you have documentation showing the association owns this property?" I asked. Margaret smiled again, although this one seemed slightly tighter than the first. Ownership is not always as simple as old maps and inherited deeds. Communities evolve. Boundaries change. Land that sits unused eventually serves a greater purpose. The sentence landed harder than she probably intended. Unused. She had just summarized 70 years of my family's history with one dismissive word. I could almost hear my grandfather laughing at the irony. Walter Walker measured value by memories, not market reports. Margaret measured everything by appearance and paperwork that benefited her position. She stepped a little closer and lowered her voice as though offering friendly advice. My recommendation is that you speak with your attorney before creating unnecessary confusion for hundreds of homeowners. I would hate for everyone to waste time chasing claims that have already been settled." Then she nodded politely, climbed back into her golf cart, and drove through the stone entrance without looking back. The security gate opened automatically for her before closing once again between us with a quiet mechanical click. It was not loud, but something about that sound stayed with me. Gates only open for the people programmed to belong. As I watched the neighborhood disappear behind iron bars, I realized Margaret had made one mistake. She never questioned whether my paperwork was authentic. She simply assumed it no longer mattered. And in my experience, the people most confident that history has been erased are usually the ones who never bothered to read the first page. I spent the next 4 days discovering just how many doors could close without anyone ever raising their voice. Every office smelled like fresh coffee, old paper, and recycled air, yet every conversation ended exactly the same way. The county recorder confirmed my deed had been legally transferred into my name. The clerk even smiled while sliding the certified copies across the counter. "Everything here looks perfectly valid, Mr. Walker." That should have settled everything. Instead, it only made the situation stranger. When I drove to the county planning department, the zoning maps displayed Silver Creek Estates exactly where my grandfather's ranch had once stretched across the valley. Roads had names now. Lots carried parcel numbers. Decorative ponds appeared where cattle watering holes used to be. It looked official enough that anyone seeing the maps for the first time would naturally assume the subdivision had always belonged there. I requested every publicly available file connected to the development. The woman behind the counter politely explained that several older records had been archived and would require additional processing time. "Probably a couple of weeks," she said with an apologetic smile. Time suddenly became another obstacle. Meanwhile, life inside the neighborhood continued without the slightest concern. Every morning, I parked along the public road outside the entrance and watched contractors trim hedges, delivery trucks unload packages, and residents wave to one another as though they were living inside a postcard. The sprinklers turned on at exactly 6 o'clock. Lawn crews arrived at 7. School buses rolled through at 8. It was an entire town operating on land that my paperwork insisted still belonged to my family. On the 5th morning, I hired a licensed surveyor named Daniel Brooks, a quiet man with 30 years of experience marking ranch boundaries across central Texas. We had barely unloaded his equipment before the security guard approached again, this time carrying a clipboard instead of a tablet. His smile looked practiced. "I am sorry, gentlemen, but the association has requested that no surveying activity take place beyond the entrance." Daniel calmly explained that he intended to verify property boundaries using publicly recorded documents. The guard nodded politely before making a phone call. Less than 10 minutes later, 2 deputies from the county sheriff's office arrived. Their uniforms looked crisp despite the afternoon heat, and the smell of sun-baked asphalt drifted through the parking area as they stepped out of their patrol vehicle. One deputy listened carefully while I explained that I was attempting to identify my own property lines. He examined my deed for several moments before handing it back. "This appears to be a civil matter," he said. "We are not here to determine ownership. We are only here to keep the peace." It was a reasonable answer, but it solved absolutely nothing. Daniel packed his survey equipment back into the truck without complaint. As he secured the final tripod, he leaned toward me and spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. "I have surveyed ranches for 3 decades, he said. "I have never seen anyone this determined to stop someone from measuring land they claim to own." That sentence stayed with me all the way back to my hotel. Late that evening, I spread every document across the small desk beneath the dim lamp in my room. Deeds, tax records, probate filings, old photographs, survey copies. Nothing explained how an entire subdivision had appeared without anyone questioning the original ownership. Somewhere between those yellowed pages and polished streets, a piece of the story was still missing. And for the first time since arriving, I stopped asking who was standing on my land and started asking who benefited from making sure nobody ever measured it. I drove back to the ranch house just before sunset, following the narrow county road that curved around the only section of the property untouched by development. The old house stood exactly as I remembered, weathered but stubborn, its white paint faded by decades of Texas summers. The porch boards creaked beneath my boots with the same familiar rhythm they had when I was a child, and the scent of cedar mixed with old leather drifted from inside the moment I unlocked the front door. Dust floated through beams of golden light streaming across the living room, illuminating photographs that had not moved in years. My grandfather always believed that if something had earned its place, it did not need replacing. Every shelf still held ranch trophies, county fair ribbons, and framed black and white pictures of relatives whose names I could barely remember. I wandered through each room searching for anything that might explain what had happened while the property sat beyond my attention. Filing cabinets contained tax receipts exactly where I expected them. Desk drawers held insurance papers and handwritten maintenance notes about fences, wells, and cattle. Everything was organized with the quiet discipline that defined Walter Walker. Yet none of it explained how an entire neighborhood had appeared without raising alarms. Then I remembered something almost forgotten. Behind the old barn sat a small storage shed that Grandpa jokingly called his time capsule because he refused to throw away anything connected to the ranch. The evening air smelled of dry hay and warm earth as I crossed the yard toward it. The wooden door protested with a long groan when I pulled it open. Inside, forgotten tools lined the walls beneath thick layers of dust. Rusted branding irons rested beside cracked feed buckets. Broken fence stretchers leaned against shelves overflowing with coffee cans filled with old bolts and nails. In the far corner sat a weathered cedar chest covered by a faded canvas tarp. I had not seen it since I was a teenager. I brushed away years of dust before lifting the heavy lid. The familiar scent of aged cedar escaped instantly, carrying memories I had not realized I still possessed. Inside were dozens of carefully labeled folders tied together with cotton string. Survey notes, water rights, mineral leases, boundary correspondence. Every label was written in my grandfather's neat block handwriting. Beneath the folders rested a rolled survey map secured by a leather strap that had darkened with age. I carefully unrolled it across an old workbench. The paper crackled softly as it flattened beneath my hands. Unlike the modern copies I had received from the county, this original survey contained handwritten notes in the margins, red pencil markings, and several references pointing toward recorded easements filed decades earlier. One corner carried my grandfather's initials beside a sentence that immediately caught my attention. It read, "Access granted only. Ownership never transferred." Those 5 words were underlined twice. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. Engineers learn early that excitement clouds judgment, so I forced myself to study every detail carefully. Tucked inside the final folder was a sealed envelope addressed simply to Ethan. The handwriting was unmistakably my grandfather's. I opened it with more care than I had opened any legal document that week. The letter was short. It did not mention neighborhoods or homeowners associations. Instead, it contained one sentence that seemed almost strangely specific. If anyone ever claims they own this land, do not start with the courthouse. Start with the map they hope nobody remembers exists. I looked back at the worn survey spread across the bench, noticing symbols and reference numbers I had overlooked only moments before. Suddenly, the missing piece no longer felt lost. It felt hidden. The next morning, I spread every document across the long dining table inside the ranch house, opening windows to let the cool morning air carry away the smell of old paper and cedar. Coffee steamed beside stacks of surveys, deeds, easement records, tax receipts, and engineering maps. I treated the table the same way I approached a bridge inspection. Every page had to connect to another page. Every date had to explain the one before it. By noon, I noticed something that had escaped everyone else. The parcel numbers used by the subdivision matched newer county maps, but the legal descriptions still traced back to the original ranch boundaries. That should not have happened if ownership had actually changed. Curious, I followed the handwritten reference numbers my grandfather had circled decades earlier. They led to a series of recorded easements filed between 1978 and 1986. Most people hear the word easement and immediately think ownership, but they are not the same thing. An easement grants permission to use land for a specific purpose. It does not transfer the land itself. As I read deeper, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Utility companies had received easements. The county had received easements for drainage improvements. A neighboring ranch had received limited access rights across one gravel road. Every document repeated the same principle in different legal language. Permission to use, never permission to own. I unfolded the original survey once more and laid it beside the modern development map. Slowly the picture became clear. The main entrance, the landscaped boulevard, the clubhouse, the artificial lake, even several visitor parking areas all appeared to sit inside corridors originally granted only for access and infrastructure decades earlier. My grandfather had anticipated future development around the ranch and cooperated with public improvements without ever surrendering ownership. Someone years later had apparently treated those access rights as though they were property lines. Whether it had started as an honest mistake or a convenient assumption, I still could not tell. But the legal distinction was enormous. I called Daniel Brooks immediately and asked him to return. Less than an hour later, he stood over the table studying both maps in complete silence. Finally, he removed his reading glasses, leaned back, and let out a slow breath. "Ethan," he said, "if these originals are authentic, this neighborhood may have been built around easements instead of ownership transfers." He did not sound excited. He sounded careful. Experienced surveyors understand that extraordinary conclusions require extraordinary verification. That was exactly what we planned to do. We spent the remainder of the afternoon cross-checking coordinates, benchmark elevations, and reference monuments recorded more than 40 years apart. Every calculation brought us back to the same conclusion. The stone entrance that welcomed residents every day was likely standing inside an access corridor. The clubhouse appeared to occupy land never conveyed away from the ranch. Even portions of the decorative lake extended beyond the areas described in later planning documents. None of this meant families had intentionally done anything wrong. They had purchased homes believing the paperwork presented to them was accurate. My grandfather had always taught me to separate people from problems, and I intended to do exactly that. My disagreement was never with the homeowners enjoying their backyards. It was with the assumption that decades of recorded history could simply disappear because newer maps looked cleaner. As the sun slipped below the horizon, its golden light reflected across the original survey, illuminating my grandfather's faded pencil note one more time. Access granted only. Ownership never transferred. For the first time since arriving, I stopped wondering whether I had a case. I started wondering who had built an entire system on the hope that nobody would ever read those 6 words. Daniel and I agreed on one rule before doing anything else. We were not going to accuse anyone. We were going to verify everything. That decision changed the entire direction of the investigation. Over the next 2 weeks, we worked quietly while life inside Silver Creek Estates continued exactly as it always had. Every morning, residents left for work, children boarded school buses, landscapers trimmed hedges with perfect precision, and delivery drivers passed through the security gate without ever realizing they were crossing property lines that had never actually been transferred. I watched from public roads, taking photographs only of visible landmarks and comparing them with survey monuments established decades earlier. As an engineer, I trusted measurements more than opinions. Distances did not exaggerate. Coordinates did not play favorites. They simply revealed the truth one point at a time. Daniel brought in another licensed surveyor to independently confirm our findings without telling him what we expected. 2 days later, he arrived at exactly the same conclusions. The original ranch boundaries remained intact. The legal access corridors existed exactly where my grandfather had documented them. The subdivision had simply expanded around those corridors until everyone assumed they represented ownership instead of permission. That independent confirmation was the moment I knew this could no longer remain a private discovery. I hired a property attorney named Rebecca Lawson, whose office overlooked the county courthouse. Unlike several attorneys I had spoken with earlier, she spent nearly 3 hours reading every page instead of offering quick opinions. The only sounds in her conference room were the turning of paper and the occasional click of her pen against the table. Finally, she closed the last folder and looked directly at me. "You have something unusual," she said carefully. "But before we discuss legal strategy, I want every document authenticated, every survey certified, and every historical filing traced back to its original recording. If we move too early, assumptions will defeat evidence." That advice sounded exactly like something my grandfather would have appreciated. So we kept working. Certified copies replaced photocopies. Original filings were requested from state archives. Historical aerial photographs showed the gradual transformation of open pasture into paved streets, while the original ranch boundary remained unchanged beneath every new layer of development. I even hired a professional mapping specialist who digitally overlaid the 1959 survey onto current satellite imagery. Watching those transparent lines settle perfectly across roads, sidewalks, the clubhouse, and the decorative lake felt almost surreal. The past had never disappeared. It had simply been covered. Throughout all of this, Margaret seemed completely unaware of what was happening. She continued hosting neighborhood board meetings, approving landscaping projects, and sending cheerful community newsletters celebrating improvements around the entrance fountain. One edition proudly announced plans for expanding visitor parking beside the clubhouse. When I compared the proposed expansion with our updated survey, I quietly smiled. The entire project sat inside the same access easement my grandfather had underlined decades earlier. Rebecca advised me not to contact the association again until every piece of evidence had been assembled. Facts are strongest, she reminded me, when they arrive all at once. By the end of the second week, our conference table no longer looked like a collection of scattered records. It looked like a complete timeline stretching back nearly 70 years, connecting every deed, every easement, every survey, every tax record, and every engineering map into one consistent story. The neighborhood had been built above history, but history had never moved. It had only waited for someone patient enough to uncover it, one document at a time. The hearing was scheduled for a quiet Thursday morning, and the courthouse felt almost ordinary as people moved through the hallways carrying folders, coffee cups, and briefcases. Nothing about the building suggested that decades of assumptions were about to be questioned. Rebecca had warned me that real legal victories rarely looked dramatic. They usually arrived one document at a time. Margaret entered the courtroom with several members of the association board, all dressed professionally and carrying neatly organized binders. She acknowledged me with the same composed smile she had worn at the neighborhood entrance weeks earlier. It was the smile of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. The judge began by reviewing the recorded deeds, tax records, and development filings before inviting both sides to present their evidence. The association explained that the community had operated successfully for years, maintained public improvements, collected assessments, and managed common areas without dispute. None of those statements were inaccurate. The neighborhood was well maintained. Families had purchased homes in good faith. Residents had every reason to believe the records presented during their purchases were complete. Then Rebecca stood and quietly placed the original 1959 survey onto the evidence table beside the authenticated copies obtained from the state archives. She carefully walked through every recorded easement, every legal description, every transfer document, and every certified overlay prepared by independent surveyors. The courtroom remained remarkably quiet as the digital maps appeared on the display screen. Transparent boundary lines settled across modern satellite photographs with unmistakable precision. The landscaped entrance, the clubhouse, the visitor parking area, the decorative lake. Every feature aligned exactly where the original ranch survey predicted. Rebecca never raised her voice. She simply pointed to one sentence repeated throughout decades of recorded filings. Access granted only. Ownership never transferred. The judge requested additional copies and spent several minutes comparing the historical records with the certified overlays. Questions shifted from general development history to the legal distinction between easement rights and ownership interests. Daniel explained the surveying methodology in careful detail, while the independent mapping specialist confirmed that every coordinate had been verified against original county monuments still existing in the field. No one challenged the mathematics because measurements do not respond to emotion. Margaret finally spoke, insisting the community had relied on long-standing assumptions accepted by everyone involved. The judge nodded respectfully before replying that assumptions, no matter how old, could not replace recorded property interests. That sentence changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. By the afternoon, the ruling was entered into the record. The court confirmed my ownership of the remaining ranch property exactly as described in the original deed, while recognizing that several common areas and access corridors had been administered under mistaken interpretations of historical easements. Instead of creating unnecessary disruption for homeowners, The judge directed the parties to negotiate updated legal agreements reflecting the actual property boundaries. Existing residents were protected, infrastructure remained in service, and future management would proceed under corrected documentation rather than inaccurate assumptions. No families lost their homes. No dramatic confrontation unfolded. The decision simply required the records to match reality. As everyone quietly gathered their papers, Margaret looked across the courtroom toward me for the first time without complete certainty. Weeks earlier, she had told me that history no longer mattered because communities evolved. Now the oldest document in the room had quietly rewritten the newest story. Walking out of the courthouse, I noticed the afternoon breeze carrying the familiar scent of warm cedar from the courthouse lawn, and I realized my grandfather had been right all along. Concrete could cover the land, but it could never erase the lines drawn beneath it. 3 months later, I drove through the same stone entrance under a very different set of circumstances. The security gate still opened with its familiar mechanical click, but this time it did not separate owners from outsiders. It simply marked the beginning of a neighborhood that finally reflected the truth recorded beneath it. The association had completed new agreements recognizing the corrected property boundaries. Long-term access rights had been properly documented, and every common area now operated under transparent legal records instead of decades of mistaken assumptions. Most residents hardly noticed the administrative changes because their daily lives continued as they always had. Children still rode bicycles along the sidewalks after school. The fountains still sent graceful streams of water into the afternoon air. Neighbors still gathered beside the clubhouse on weekends to share food and conversation. That had always been the outcome I wanted. My disagreement had never been with families building memories. It had been with the belief that history could simply be rewritten because enough time had passed. A week after the court's decision, Margaret requested a private meeting inside the clubhouse conference room. The polished wooden table overlooked the lake where sunlight danced across the surface exactly as it had on the day I first arrived. She appeared noticeably quieter than before, not defeated, but reflective. She admitted that many board members had inherited records from previous leadership without ever questioning the original legal descriptions. They had relied on assumptions repeated so many times that no one thought to compare them with the oldest surveys still resting inside county archives. We spoke for nearly an hour, not about blame, but about responsibility. Before leaving, she handed me a folder containing updated community records along with a simple apology for dismissing my concerns before examining the evidence. I accepted it because my grandfather taught me that resolving a problem mattered more than winning an argument. During the following weeks, I restored the old ranch house, repaired the weathered porch, and carefully preserved the cedar chest that had quietly changed everything. I framed the original survey beside my grandfather's handwritten letter and hung them together above the fireplace where future generations would always see them. Daniel visited one afternoon carrying freshly printed survey maps reflecting every corrected boundary. Rebecca stopped by a few days later with the final recorded agreements. We shared coffee on the porch while a gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar, warm grass, and distant rain across the fields that still surrounded the neighborhood. Looking toward the subdivision, I could hear lawn mowers in the distance, children laughing near the lake, and wind moving through the same oak trees my grandmother had planted decades earlier. The land had changed, but its story had not. I often think back to that first afternoon when someone politely informed me I was trespassing on property my family had cared for across generations. At the time, those words felt almost impossible to believe. Now they remind me how easily confidence can replace curiosity when nobody pauses to ask where a story truly began. The oldest map, the forgotten cedar chest, the faded survey notes, the quiet sentence underlined twice, and the advice my grandfather left behind all returned exactly when they were needed most. Every small detail that seemed ordinary eventually became part of a much larger truth. As the sun settled beyond the western pasture, painting the sky with deep shades of gold and amber, I stood beside the old windmill listening to its familiar creak carried across the evening air. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, everything finally felt exactly where it belonged. My grandfather had been right. Justice does not have to arrive with noise or anger. Sometimes it arrives quietly, patiently, one honest document at a time.